25 years ago, a woman painted an image of agony. Ominous clouds surround two men, clenched in exhausted gridlock. No movement seems possible, just an impotent and miserable stasis. It so clearly suggests our current polarized times. Might a breakthrough be possible? Though the figure's feet and bodies parallel the horizon, the dynamic angle of the clouds and rocks suggest the standstill might eventually be broken. But which side will win is unknowable. Martha Mayer Erlebacher painted this in 1996. By the time she died in 2013, she had become one of America's leading realist painters and professors of art. Her knowledge of anatomy and painterly technique were impeccable. But these were always only the means, not the end, for her art.
The notion of spending years learning the figure and then making a painting is nuts. If you're studying the figure, you have to start making paintings the minute you start studying the figure. And as you're getting better at drawing and understanding the figure, your paintings will get better. But I've seen so many graduates of ateliers who have learned to draw the figure, and then they have nothing to say. So what you have to do is say to yourself, what do I believe is the most important thing about life? And then try to make an image about that right away. And then make another one. And in between at night, early in the morning, you can study your head.
As we learn about Martha, let's look at her remarkable work. She excelled at figure compositions and portraits. She also was one of the best still life painters in the world. Martha Mayer was born in 1937. In high school, she studied at the Art Students League. She graduated from Pratt Institute in 1960 as the school's only female industrial design student. In Florence McEwen's 1986 PhD thesis, Martha is quoted as saying,
"I knew I had to earn a living. Studying painting was out of the question from that point of view. Industrial design was the most disciplined of the courses at Pratt. It had the strictest standard of drawing. I really didn't have the right mindset for industrial design. If we were told to design a new traffic light, my reaction was, what's wrong with the old one?"
In 1961, Martha married a Pratt teacher and industrial designer named Walter Erlebacher. Walter became a sculptor, and Martha pursued her interest in painting and received her master's in fine art, also from Pratt in 1963. Martha said,
"I came out of a tradition of abstraction, with an understanding that, without a notion of abstract composition, representational composition doesn't work either. And without an understanding of the abstract relationships of the body and the abstract ideas of proportion, you can't do anything representational."
I am Frank Galuska, and I knew Martha and Walter from the mid-1970s.
Artist Frank Galuska told me, eventually she and Walter embarked on a rigorous program of self-study in anatomy, perspective, and the other fundamentals of representational depiction. Art schools in those days were not teaching these things with any rigor.
It was an act of rebellion against the academy of its time. He and Walter felt that they were creating a gift for humankind against great resistance, but they believed they would prevail, and that the mediocrity of contemporary art, which is how they saw contemporary art, would wake up and see the light, and that they would be there to show the way. The Academy favored other things and had lost all contact with the kind of art that she was interested in.
I was brought up believing that the real content of art is ideas. But it has to be ideas made manifest through some kind of humanistic subject matter.
The Erlebachers saw the Renaissance as a blueprint for that humanism.
When I first met Walter, he was projecting Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling frescoes into a three-dimensional sculpture. Walter was impressed with Michelangelo not only because of the beauty of his work, but because of the complexity and integrity of his mind and the grandeur of his achievement. Walter felt that if he sensed the potential for greatness in himself, why not go for it?
If Walter was moved by the ambition of a Michelangelo, Martha seems to have been more interested in how Renaissance ideas could be adapted for her own era.
When you say Renaissance painting, people groan. Oh, boring. I hope my figures will look contemporary, but still be rooted in tradition, from the point of view of structure, not perception. The subject matter for those days is not the subject matter for today. People haven't changed, but the emphasis of their concerns has. In those days, they never worried whether the earth was going to be poisoned. That is probably one of the deepest concerns of people today. Killing nature is killing life. I worry all the time about future generations.
The Erlebachers settled in Elkins Park outside of Philadelphia. Frank told me that the intellectual couple's home library was filled with books on aesthetics and philosophy.
She was interested in using symbolism, and she was really fond of a book by Cesare Ripa on iconology and moral qualities of iconology. And she read that book carefully over and over again, searching for some of the things that she was going to paint.
Another favorite was The White Goddess. In it, poet Robert Graves analyzes the structures of myth, particularly the power of female divinity. Goddesses notwithstanding, Martha was straddling the lines between housewife and professional artist. Although Walter had a spacious sculpture studio, her first workspace left much to be desired.
Martha's studio on Church Road in Elkins Park was a hallway in the house, and she painted next to a washer and a dryer. She said she could paint and do laundry at the same time. Her work ethic was strong beyond description. The space she painted in was so shallow she relied on perspective to make space work rather than observation, as she couldn't step back far enough to take in the whole large painting. This gives some of her early work an archaic quality, like the early Renaissance.
Frank said Martha could become a little obsessive about classical values. The Greeks believed that the golden rectangle was the perfect shape. He asked her once about composition.
How did you put that fork there? She said, golden section. I said, well, what about that spoon? Golden section. How about that plant? Golden section. A dozen things, each one of them. It was the golden section. So I said to her, don't you ever just say, I'm just going to put it where I want to put it? And she said, who am I to decide?
Walter died in 1991, a few months short of his 58th birthday. Martha's friend, the art historian Christina Waters, discusses Martha's spirit.
Martha was not a political feminist. She was more like a Wild West superhero. She'd done all the stereotypical classical women's things. She'd had 2 children she adored. She'd mastered all the craft arts from needlepoint to pasta. She was a great cook. She was really handy with a hammer and a saw. She made all her own stretchers down in her basement workroom. She certainly was a heroic person in every respect. Heroic in her painting, in which women were clearly mythic. She was also heroic in her own personal tenacity. Fresh with tragedy of the loss of a much-loved husband, she simply stormed ahead with her painting, with her teaching, mentoring. But she was a drill sergeant as a teacher. He didn't mess with her. She was ferocious, actually. When discussing art, she would argue and storm and insist. She was extremely opinionated and firm in her beliefs. Everything about her was very serious and purposeful, and yet she had this extravagantly voluptuous side. When her life was ending, she told us that she was going to listen her way through the entire collection of Mozart's works. And I'm quite sure she did. She was a force of nature.
Now for a student's eye view of this force of nature.
I'm Noah Buchanan. I studied with Martha at the New York Academy of Art and also at her home in Elkins Park. We continued to be close friends up until she passed. Martha was known as having this very hard exterior. I was telling her about a favorite painting of mine that she had done, 2 figures embracing in the dark. She said, "Oh, you like that painting? That painting is my..." And she trailed off and she burst out crying. I was so shocked and surprised because I had never seen that side of her. I realized that she was an incredibly sensitive and vulnerable person like we all are, and that she was hiding that beneath this rougher, more resilient exterior. Another time I was talking with Martha about an interaction she had where she told the person off. She said, "Why do I do that?" "Well, you were arguing with the person." And she said, No. Why do I do that?" And I didn't know how to respond because she always seems so sure and confident of herself publicly. And I said, "I think that you feel that your work isn't appreciated as much as it deserves to be," which I think is true. And I think that she did feel that way inside. And I think that it made her have this rough exterior that she presented to the world. But it wasn't really who she was on a closer, more personal level.
Artist Eileen Goodman gives some insights into the personality of her friend.
I can't remember Martha ever just sitting around doing nothing. When I visited her, just chatting or talking, she'd be knitting or needle pointing, always beautifully, always meticulously. Once we bumped into each other at an exhibition opening. We were both looking at the artist's painting closely. Suddenly she said, "The artist doesn't have the hand," meaning the touch, the surface mark. And she was right. She could seem stern at times, but she could be funny. Once she described someone with a little physical comedy by doing a Groucho Marx walk. I loved it.
Martha was truly loved by her fellow artists.
My name is John Nava. I'm a figurative artist from Ojai, California. Martha had a number of very close friends, and I'm lucky to feel I was one of them. Over the years, I stayed with Martha many times in Elkins Park. We used to make meals for each other. In this clip made of Martha toward the end of her life, she's still keeping up this tradition. I met Martha at an arts program in the early 1980s. I walked into a darkened room where Martha was commenting on a slide. It was one of Gauguin's Tahitian Girls, and Martha couldn't accept the anatomy. She said, "I'm not a friend of Gauguin." The workshop host had noticed me enter and asked me what I thought of Gauguin. I knew nothing of Martha at the time. but I thought her remark was so odd. I said, "Well, I am a friend of Gauguin." This got a big laugh. Amazingly, Martha was not offended by my wisecrack. Instead, we ended up having an elaborate lunch, which began with a martini. From then on, whenever we would meet, our first meal would always begin with that drink. She loved this funny ritual. We often visited museums together, comparing friends that we found among the masters on view. We also would go out to the Pennsylvania countryside to haunt antiques flea markets. She loved searching for pewter and ceramics and faux fruit made of stone. I love these outings. It was so much fun to snorkel around the cluttered booths with her, looking for great finds and watching her bargain with sellers. Later, instead of museums or flea markets, I drove her to medical appointments. We talked a lot. She was sardonic about her circumstances and rueful about all that she still wished to do. But Martha accepted the obliviousness of nature, grudgingly but honestly. I'm still overwhelmed by her courage and her dignity.
When I asked on Facebook if anyone had known Martha, my friend Karen Ergang reached out immediately. She and her husband Ben Layden knew her very well.
Ben and I lived across the street from Martha for about 25 years.
And during that time, I would go in and look at her artwork. It was always astounding to me, and she really wanted to know my opinion. Sometimes she would ask me, what do I think the painting is about? And if I guessed something pretty close to what she actually was intending, she was always very happy about that. And I went over with some very naive questions. Are you able to see things in your mind and paint them? Or do you need to have a reference? And she told me she needed the reference in front of her and then paint what she saw.
My relationship with Martha was not so much around her artwork, but as a mother to a mother. I was pretty young when we moved in, and I was pregnant with my third child. Martha's sons were grown adults and out of the house. But there was a large pack of kids they ran around with in the neighborhood. And Martha had the best backyard for games like kickball, tag, because it was completely flat. She was really happy to have the kids come and play in the yard. The only rule was that they had to come and knock on the door and tell her they were there and introduce anybody who was new.
Martha used her neighbors as models. When she asked me to model for her, I knew a lot of her paintings depicted nudes. Martha, what do you want? I can stand here naked. And she assured me she wanted me to leave my shorts on. It was a very nice experience. She actually spent quite a bit of time taking pictures and then used those pictures as a reference. Martha once showed me a box she constructed where she would set up a still life and do lighting and then use that as her reference for doing her paintings. She was painting bowls of fruit, and the problem was that the fruit would change over the course of a week as it rotted. And so she began painting plastic fruit because it stayed the same. It became a passion of hers to find plastic fruit that looked as much like real fruit as possible. And she even found some that she felt looked more like the fruit than the actual fruit itself.
When my oldest was around 4, I took him over to Martha's house. He was very interested in art and drawing, and I thought it would be fun for him. And we walked into her house, and to the right was Walter's library. Every surface was covered with books and anatomical drawings, and the most impressive thing for my little boy was a life-size skeleton. And what I remember Martha saying to him was, if you don't brush your teeth, you're going to have teeth like the skeleton. Then we went into her studio. She was showing us some of her paintings, and my little boy was absolutely astounded because they were so beautiful and realistic. But Martha was saying that one of them wasn't exactly as she wanted it, and it wasn't perfect. And so my little 4-year-old said, well, that's okay, it doesn't have to be perfect. Martha just looked at him and in a very flat tone said, yes, it does.
One day Martha and I were standing outside her home talking about the shrubbery, and she told me that she would like her home to look just like a funeral home. That was the aesthetic she was going for.
Everyone on the block really cared for Martha. And as she got older, everyone was looking out for her. So we all knew that she was this astounding artist who still went to New York 3 days a week to work at Pratt and then was home. 3 years before she died, it was in the winter, she plugged in a space heater into an extension cord, which started a fire. Very quickly, smoke was coming out of the windows. Someone called the fire department, who arrived immediately. The whole neighborhood was out because she was so well loved. They got her out of the house, and her eyebrows were singed. She never lost her composure, and all she kept talking about was, don't allow the firemen to bring hoses in the house. That's my life's work. So they brought her to me. I put her in a blanket, and she was insistent that she didn't want to go to the hospital. All she wanted was to make sure that the firemen did not flood her house. So all of us individually went up to different firefighters and said, do not flood the house. And they didn't. They were careful, and they saved her artwork.
At the end of her life, she knew that when she was gone, her talent went with her. But she wasn't finished. She went on a mad dash, extremely productive time for her right at the end because she wanted to finish all these ideas she had, and she knew her time was running out. She lost all of her hair with the chemotherapy. She took off her hat and showed me, and I said, Martha, you're beautiful. And she said, thank you, you're very kind. And then later she did a self-portrait without hair. If you look at it, you can see I wasn't just saying those words. She was truly very beautiful.
It was essentially the bald head that got me, that I was interested in studying the form of my head without stinting.
Are you pretty happy about the results of the competition?
Of course, I'm thrilled.
Good.
But my portrait's not going to win a beauty contest, if you know what I mean. What I find the most fun is to look at something and replicate it and copy it. In other words, something that's out there and then make a two-dimensional image of it.
Martha created one body of work that nonplussed her hardcore realist fans.
One day I went to visit Martha, and she wanted to show me a series of paintings of ducks, done in all of the modern artists' styles, so cubist and whatever. It was very funny. You know how people do impersonations of people's voices? This was her version of that, doing impersonations of various paintings. And just in the same way that impersonators sometimes poke a little fun at the folks they're impersonating, that was definitely what her intent was. And I remember saying to her that time, Martha, I knew there was a reason I really liked you.
She was pretty darn good at impersonating the techniques of these artists. But how about her own work? Noah Buchanan learned in detail how Martha painted her figures. The technique she devised was
meant to replicate Baroque period painting techniques, similar to the way Caravaggio and Rubens painted. This all started on an earth red ground. She preferred Indian red. And she would mix this heavily with lead white. So she was always proud of her pink grounds. And on top of that, she would begin the first layer of her underpainting, which was a transparent wash made out of sap green and alizarin crimson. Together, these two colors would create a really beautiful sepia, earth tone, brownish green. It was a very beautiful color. And she would work up a transparent wash of all the tonality of the figure, the shadow mask, but also halftones seen in the light areas of the figure as well. When the wash was still wet, she would work into this with a limited palette using just the earth red, black, and lead white. She called this her lavender palette. It was amazing that when mingled with this wash of sap green and alizarin crimson, you could actually produce almost yellow in a flesh tone sense. When this layer dried, she would apply a velatura on top of the entire thing made out of lead white and terra verte. And this would produce all kinds of optical cools. Bluish and silver and grayish colors would come forward in an indirect way. When that layer had dried, she would then glaze this with transparent golden ochre. She would always drop a little bit of cadmium red light into that to warm it up a little bit. And while the glaze was wet, she would work into that with a full color palette, and she would just go for it at that point with matching the flesh tones that she saw. What was brilliant about her technique is that it was incredibly efficient. She was able to not have to do much with the full color palette because the underpainting palette took care of most of what she wanted to capture from the figure.
Beginning in 2003, Martha created a group of 4 extraordinary paintings. I believe they stand as her crowning achievement, both from a technical standpoint and as a profound statement about the human condition. I asked artists Frank Galuska and Noah Buchanan to discuss their friends' masterworks.
Martha's paintings of the cycle of life begin with architectural settings in the first 3 paintings. In the first piece, Childhood, the space is extremely shallow, like an Egyptian relief.
A grouping of adolescent girls at dawn and the springtime of life. And they're composed in what looks to be a evolutionary chart. And I think that she's setting the stage for the evolution of these chapters in our lives. And what fascinates me is that she's taken mixtures from her underpainting palette and created a tile pattern at the base of the painting. I love the way that she's tied together the dawn and the springtime of life with the equivalent moment in her own procedure in making a painting.
In the second, the figure group is assembled on and around a kind of pedestal or altar. This piece seems to be about personal and sexual realization.
She talked about this painting being very much about fire, young adulthood, a perfect time in terms of the physicality of ourselves. And she looked on these figures as being idealized, attractive, and sexualized in partially erotic ways. She portrays it with a lot of reverence, but I think that she also feels that this is not the most intellectually rich period of the cycle of life.
In the third, there is a procession through architecture. This suggests a transgenerational, social, or political context of human endeavor and continuity, which is the concern of a later stage in life.
By far the largest and most ambitious of the series takes place at sunset, corresponds to the season of autumn in our lives. This painting is the one that Martha identified with the most when she was painting it. I think that she herself felt that she was in this phase of her life, or maybe passing out of this phase, as the characters seem to be doing in the painting. This painting seems to have the most sense of a commonly shared experience, the feeling that we're all moving through this life together. So this painting seems to be emblematic of the cycle of life.
The architectural context is gone in the fourth painting. The environment encroaches upon us. The landscape is desolate. Martha has said that though it is not a self-portrait, this figure is her. So it is all of us too. It expresses our membership in mortality. In the end, we find ourselves in the common state of being alone.
Visiting with Martha, we went to the studio and she said, "You see that?" And she smacked the canvas with her hand. "That's me. Soon I'll be sleeping with the worms." And that was something that she said pretty often, with a lot of empowerment and resolve that this was the inevitable outcome of a physical life.
For me, number 4 of the cycle of life and her final self-portrait are the best.
Why was Martha so intent on not just how the human body looked, but how it functioned. Agon means struggle. In an early preparatory drawing, the figure on the right is leaping off the ground. The other figure's feet are close together. Martha knew that this gave the advantage to the attacker, whose momentum would surely knock his opponent off balance. So she redrew the legs and feet of her protagonists, and in so doing created an entirely different meaning to the pose. This awful sense of deadlock is what gives Agon such enduring power. Martha's description of Renaissance art also characterizes her own.
Those paintings have realistic figures. Pieces of the painting are taken from life, but the entire work is a construct of the imagination. It's essentially a work of the mind rather than the eye. It is a vision, but a structured vision.